More now on the news that employment in the UK is seeing the largest fall in over a decade. The number of people in work has dropped by nearly 750,000 since the lockdown began. Well, we're joined now by Charlotte Pickles, who is director at Reform. That's a centre-right think tank focused on public services. Thanks so much for joining us. What do you read into these figures?
Well, I think first of all, it's worth saying that although that decline in the employment rate is dramatic, it's really just a holding pattern at the moment. So if you look at some of the underlying figures, if you look at, for example, the vacancy rates, if you look at the number of people who are claiming benefits because they're unemployed, you look at the rise in economic inactivity. So that means people who are not working but not yet seeking work. We have got a crisis coming up in the next few months.
And yet, last week, the Bank of England revised down its unemployment forecast, didn't it, for the year, saying it now expected it to peak at 7.5% this year. Are you saying you don't agree with that? You think it's going to be much worse?
I think we don't know yet. But what the Bank of England has also said is they're expecting 1.4 million people who are on furlough to end up not going back to work, but actually ending up unemployed. So yes, it would be great if the unemployment rate was lower than expected, but I don't think we can guarantee that it will be. And we've seen lots of adjustments in lots of forecasts. And part of that is because we just don't know what's going to happen with the virus. So as we sit here now, we have businesses that still can't open. Most businesses have got revenues that are lower than the revenues they would have had pre-crisis. We've got the threat of a second wave of the virus. We've got local lockdowns, and I think it would be fair to say it's likely we'll see more of those. We're not seeing the V-shaped recovery. We're not seeing demand recover at the pace that we would need to see. And all of that points to an unemployment crisis. And in the middle of it, we're going to see the furlough scheme end, and many of those people are just going to be made redundant, and the jobs aren't there for them to move into.
So when the Prime Minister says he concedes there are going to be bumpy months ahead, but that he's confident the country will get through this stronger than ever before, are you suggesting we shouldn't really take him at his word?
I think it depends how much more active or interventionist the government wants to be. So I think they've done a remarkable job at protecting as many jobs as possible so far via the schemes that they've set up. The challenge is what they do next. And, you know, it's almost a month ago to the week that the Chancellor stood up and gave his sort of mini budget, the economic statement, where he said he was going to do everything he could to make sure that we were protecting jobs and creating jobs. Now, one of the big risks is that by removing the furlough scheme prematurely, actually what we're going to see is this big spike in unemployment. And because we haven't got the economy back to where we need it to get to in order to create new jobs for those people to move into, we are at a real risk of seeing a sort of unemployment crisis that we've not seen since the Great Depression, far worse than in 2008. So I would like to share the optimism of the Prime Minister. I think it's in the gift of the government to intervene to prevent that sort of dire crisis. But right now, the measures in place are not sufficient.
You say removing the furlough scheme prematurely. There are two difficulties, aren't there, though? One is that there's a danger that by extending it, you risk keeping people in unproductive jobs. And the second is the country simply can't afford it.
Well, let me take the second barrier, if you like, first. So the country can afford it. It is eye-wateringly expensive. It's about £10 billion a month or it was at the full numbers. Obviously, we've seen some people come off the furlough scheme now. So it is very expensive. But actually, the government, and not just our government, governments across the world are spending unprecedented amounts of money. And because borrowing is so low, the cost of borrowing is so low, that is affordable at the moment. And actually, the costs of the furlough scheme pale compared to the unbelievable economic and social costs of a mass unemployment crisis. So I don't think we should be thinking about the cost as the biggest barrier right now. In terms of whether it will preserve, if you like, zombie jobs, so jobs that wouldn't be there if it weren't for these government subsidies, absolutely there is a risk of that. Of course there is. And that's why any extension of the furlough scheme should be targeted. It shouldn't be available anymore to any business that wants to use it. It's not been targeted so far. That means that some businesses using the furlough scheme will not have been in financial distress. And that's certainly not something the taxpayer should be funding. But in those sectors where, as I said at the start, businesses are still required to be shut and other businesses are still well below the sort of revenue that they would expect in quotes normal times, actually it's reasonable to say we're going to continue supporting jobs in those sectors, and we're going to be a bit more flexible about how those employers use the furlough. So, for example, allowing them to bring people off and on. If there's a local lockdown, that could be very helpful. So it shouldn't be a blanket extension, but actually the costs of not extending it in a limited way will far outweigh the costs of just scrapping it.
Charlotte Pickles, we must leave it there. Directorate Reform, good to have your thoughts. Thank you. Let's update you with the headlines.